Hello, everyone, and welcome to a slightly unusual but still hopefully wholesome and lovely edition of Janatee's Crafting Corner. I found out a handful of days ago that today, March 25th, is Tolkien Reading Day for 2022. Apparently, this happens every year. I remember it happening at my college because this is supposedly the day that Frodo threw the ring into Mordor. They would do reenactments with costumes and readings, and it was amazing. And I sadly never went to see it, and I do wish I did. But hopefully I will carry on the tradition by reading a little bit of The Hobbit today. I was read this aloud as a child by my mom, and she was also my teacher because I was homeschooled, and this was part of just learning reading and stories, and it was a lovely experience, and this book resonated with me a lot back then, and just the sort of pleasant adventurousness resonates with me a lot as an adult, so hopefully you will enjoy having it shared with you today. I do have here with me a lovely Gandalf, but he has not yet made an appearance, so he can wait over there until he deigns to show up. I've also added a little excuse me, a little candle for atmosphere, some chicory-root tea. I googled what kind of tea do hobbits drink, and it seemed like lots of roots and berries, and so that is what we will be drinking today. If you are in the chat, please say hello, share if you have read or have a relationship with this book, or if you are experiencing it for the first time. And after this drink break, we will go ahead and get started. I'm already a big fan of this tea. This edition is from the 60s, I am pretty sure. It is old and ancient, and I love it. Books as objects are quite lovely to me. It also apparently once belonged to the Canley Chapel Library. This is what we would probably now call a prelude. I'll do my best to both use a pleasant voice and also be clear as to when I am speaking casually and when I am reading, although if I'm talking and describing what's going on in the Shire or whatnot, it's a pretty good bet that I'm reading. What is a hobbit? Hobbits are little people, smaller than dwarfs. They love peace and quiet and good tilled earth. They dislike machines, but they are handy with tools. They are nimble, but don't like to hurry. They have sharp ears and eyes. They're inclined to be fat. They wear bright colors, but seldom wear shoes. They like to laugh and eat 6 meals a day and drink. They like parties, and they like to give and receive presents. They inhabit a land they call the Shire, a place between the river Brandywine and the Far Downs. The Hobbit is a story of these delightful creatures, a story complete in itself yet full of portent. For this is the book that tells of Bilbo Baggins, the far-wandering hobbit who discovered, some say stole, the one ring of power and brought it back to the Shire. And so, this is the absolute necessary beginning to the great story of the War of the Rings, which J.R.R. Tolkien completes in his epic fantasy trilogy, The Lord of the Rings. I have a feeling this was added after the after the fact, as the next page is bundles of blurbs trying to sell you the Fellowship of the Ring. But the book proper is The Hobbit, or There and Back Again. I'm still very entertained by how much, this book is this is the preferred author's edition. This is the authorized paperback edition. And on the back, it's got a big old picture of J.R.R. Tolkien that says, "This paperback edition and no other has been published with my consent and cooperation. Those who approve of courtesy, at least to living authors, will purchase it and no other." I just find that charming. The marketing is always present, even though it was different, 60 years ago. Goodness gracious. All right. Chapter 1, An Unexpected Party. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. It had a perfectly round door, like a porthole, painted green with a shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle. The door opened onto a tube-shaped hall like a tunnel, a very comfortable tunnel without smoke, with paneled walls and floors tiled and carpeted, provided with polished chairs and lots of pegs for hats and coats. The hobbit was fond of visitors. The tunnel wound on and on, going fairly but not quite straight into the side of the hill. The hill, as many people for many miles round called it. It's the capital hill. Hello, Kravitz! We are indeed reading The Hobbit today. If you've ever read it before, do share your favorite parts with as few spoilers as possible. And if you haven't, welcome. I do quite love this book. There's a lot to enjoy about it, and I do. And many little round doors opened out of it, first on one side and then on another. No going upstairs for the hobbit. Bedrooms, bathrooms, cellars, pantries, lots of these. Wardrobes, he had whole rooms devoted to clothes. Kitchens, dining rooms, all were on the same floor, and indeed on the same passage. The best rooms were all on the left-hand side, going in, for those were the only ones to have windows. Deep-set, round windows looking over his garden and meadows beyond, sloping down to the river. This hobbit was a very well-to-do hobbit, and his name was Baggins. The Bagginses had lived in the neighborhood of the Hill for time out of mind, and people considered them very respectable, not only because most of them were rich, but also because they never had any adventures or did anything unexpected. You could tell what a Baggins would say on any question without the bother of asking them. This is a story of how a Baggins had an adventure, and found himself doing and saying things altogether unexpected. He may have lost the neighbors' respect, but he gained, well, you will see whether he gained anything in the end. The mother of our particular hobbit, what is a hobbit? I suppose hobbits need some description nowadays, since they have become rare and shy of the big people, as they call us. They are, or were, a little people, about half our height, and smaller than the bearded dwarves. Hobbits have no beards. There is little or no magic about them, except the ordinary everyday sort which helps them to disappear quietly and quickly when large stupid folk like you and me come blundering along, making a noise like elephants which they can hear a mile off. They're inclined to be fat in the stomach. They dress in bright colors, chiefly green and yellow, wear no shoes because their feet grow natural leathery soles and thick, warm brown hair like the stuff on their heads, which is curly, have long, clever brown fingers, good-natured faces, and laugh deep, fruity laughs, especially after dinner, which they have twice a day when they can get it. Now you know enough to go on with. As I was saying, the mother of this hobbit, of Bilbo Baggins, that is, was the famous Belladonna Took, one of the 3 remarkable daughters of the old Took, head of the hobbits who lived across the water, the small river that ran at the foot of the hill. It was often said in other families that long ago one of the Took ancestors must have taken a fairy wife. That was, of course, absurd, but certainly there was still something not entirely hobbit-like about them, and once in a while members of the Took clan would go and have adventures. They discreetly disappeared and the family hushed it up, but the fact remains that the Tooks were not as respectable as the Bagginses, though they were undoubtedly richer. Not that Belladonna Took ever had any adventures after she became Mrs. Bungo Baggins. Bungo, that was Bilbo's father, built the most luxurious hobbit hole for her, and partly with her money, that was to be found either under the hill or over the hill or across the water, and there they remained, until the end of their days. Still, it is probable that Bilbo, her only son, although he looked and behaved exactly like a second edition of his solid and comfortable father, got something a bit odd in his makeup from the Took side, something that only waited for a chance to come out. The chance never arrived until Bilbo Baggins was grown up, being about 50 years old or so, and living in the beautiful Hobbit hole built by his father, which I have just described for you, until he had, in fact, apparently settled down immovably. By some curious chance, one morning long ago in the quiet of the world, where there was less noise and more green, and the hobbits were still numerous and prosperous, and Bilbo Baggins was standing at his door after breakfast, smoking an enormous long wooden pipe that reached nearly down to his woolly toes, neatly brushed, Gandalf came by. Gandalf. If you had heard only a quarter of what I have heard about him, and I have only heard very little of all there is to hear, you would be prepared for any sort of remarkable tale. Tales and adventures sprouted up all over the place wherever he went in the most extraordinary fashion. He had not been down that way under the hill for ages and ages, not since his friend the old Took died, in fact, and the hobbits had almost forgotten what he looked like. He had been away over the hill and across the water on business of his own since they were all small hobbit children. I'm going to reorient a little bit. Bungo is a lovely name. I like Bungo. I will also add that since this edition is from the 1960s, I am doing a little bit of, as I go along, corrections or like modernizations. Like it uses he as like a general pronoun and stuff like that. There's also some like words, like slang words that mean things that they don't mean anymore. So if you are trying to read along with either the text on the screen or some edition of your own, that is where the problems or discrepancies are. There's one notable word that means a very different thing now that I will not be saying aloud later in the stream. That's part of a song. A note on the songs also. Actually, I'll wait to share that until we get to the actual songs itself. But in the meanwhile, we'll see what Gandalf is up to. All that the unsuspecting Bilbo saw that morning was an old man with a staff. He had a tall pointed blue hat. A tall pointed blue hat, a long gray cloak, a silver scarf over which a white beard hung down below his waist, and immense black boots. "Good morning," said Bilbo, and he meant it. The sun was shining and the grass was very green, but Gandalf looked at him from under long, bushy eyebrows that stuck out further than the brim of his shady hat. "What do you mean?" he said. "Do you wish me a good morning? Or do you mean that is a good morning whether I want it or not? Or that you feel good this morning? Or that is a morning to be good on?" "All of them at once," said Bilbo, "and a very fine morning for a pipe of tobacco out of doors in the bargain. If you have a pipe about you, sit down and have a fill of mine. There's no hurry, and we have all the day before us." Then Bilbo sat down on a seat by his door, crossed his legs, and blew out a beautiful gray ring of smoke that sailed up into the air without breaking and floated away over the hill. "Very pretty," said Gandalf, "but I have no time to blow smoke rings this morning. I'm looking for someone to share in an adventure that I'm arranging, and it's very difficult to find anyone." "I should think so in these parts. We are plain, quiet folk and have no use for adventures. Nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things. Make you late for dinner." "I can't think what anybody sees in them," said our Mr. Baggins, and stuck one thumb behind his braces and blew out another even bigger smoke ring. Then he took out his morning letters and began to read, pretending to take no more notice of the old man. He had decided that he was not quite his sort and wanted him to go away. But the old man did not move. He stood leaning on his stick and gazing at the hobbit without saying anything. till Bilbo got quite uncomfortable and even a little cross. "Good morning," he said at last. "We don't want any adventures here, thank you. You might try over the hill or across the water." By this he meant that the conversation was at an end. "What a lot of things you do use good morning for," said Gandalf. "Now you mean that you want to get rid of me, and that it wouldn't be good until I move off." Not at all, my dear sir. Let me see. I don't think I know your name." Yes, my dear sir, and I do know your name, Mr. Bilbo Baggins, and you do know my name, though you don't remember that I belong to it. I am Gandalf, and Gandalf means me. To think that I should have lived to be good-morninged by Belladonna Took's son as if I were selling buttons at the door. Gandalf! Good gracious me. Not the wandering wizard that gave old Took a pair of magic diamond studs that fastened themselves and never came undone till ordered? Not the fellow who used to tell such wonderful tales at parties about dragons and goblins and giants and the rescue of princesses and the unexpected luck of widows' sons? Not the man that used to make such particularly excellent fireworks. I remember those. Old Took used to have them on Midsummer's Eve. Splendid. They used to go up like great lilies at snapdragons and laburnums of fire, and hang in the twilight all evening. You will notice already that Mr. Baggins was not quite so prosy as he liked to believe, also that he was very fond of flowers. "Dear me," he went on, "not the Gandalf who was responsible for so many quiet folks going off into the blue for mad adventures. Anything from climbing trees to visiting elves, or sailing in ships, sailing to other shores. Bless me, life used to be quite you used to upset things badly in these parts once upon a time. I beg your pardon, but I had no idea you were still in business." "Where else should I be?" said the wizard. "All the same, I am pleased to find you remember something about me. You seem to remember my fireworks kindly at any rate, and that is not without hope. Indeed, for your old grandfather Took's sake, and for the sake of poor Belladonna, I will give you what you asked for." "I beg your pardon, I haven't asked for anything." "Yes, you have, twice now. My pardon, I give it to you. In fact, I will go so far as to send you on this adventure. Very amusing for me, very good for you, and profitable too, very likely, if you ever get over it. Sorry, I don't want any adventures, thank you. Not today. Good morning, but please come to tea any time you like. Why not tomorrow? Come tomorrow. Goodbye." With that, the hobbit turned and scuttled inside his round green door and shut it as quickly as he dared, not to seem rude. Wizards, after all, are wizards. "What on earth did I ask him to tea for?" he said to himself as he went to the pantry. He had only just had breakfast, but he thought a cake or two and a drink or something would do him good after his fright. Gandalf, in the meantime, was still standing outside the door and laughing long but quietly. After a while he stepped up, and with the spike of his staff scratched an odd sign on the hobbit's beautiful green front door. Then he strode away, just about the time when Bilbo was finishing his second cake and beginning to think that he had escaped adventures very well. I'm going to take another drink break for the moment. I'm sorry I keep wandering the book towards me. But my glasses prescription is ever so slightly out of date. And it's a little hard at times. I'm also trying to keep Gandalf in frame as much as possible, even though I have sadly discovered that his hat is supposed to be blue. But you get the picture. Alright, next day, what occurs? The next day, he had almost forgotten about Gandalf. He did not remember things very well, unless he put them down on his engagement tablet, like this: Gandalf Tea Wednesday. Yesterday, he had been too flustered to do anything of the kind. Same, Bilbo. Oh, that's a mood. Just before tea time, there came a tremendous ring on the front doorbell, and then he remembered. He rushed and put on the kettle and put out another cup and saucer and an extra cake or two and ran to the door. "I am so sorry to keep you waiting," he was going to say, when he saw that it was not Gandalf at all. It was a dwarf with a blue beard tucked into a golden belt and very bright eyes under his dark green hood. As soon as the door was opened, he pushed inside, just as if he had been expected. He hung his hooded cloak on the nearest peg, and, "Dwalin at your service," he said with a low bow. "Bilbo Baggins at yours," said the hobbit, too surprised to ask any questions for the moment. When the silence that followed had become uncomfortable, he added, "I am just about to take tea. Pray come and have some with me." A little stiff, perhaps, but he meant it kindly. "And what would you do if an uninvited dwarf came and hung his things up in your hall without a word of explanation?" They had not been at table long. In fact, they had hardly touched the third cake, when there came another, even louder ring at the bell. "Excuse me," said the hobbit, and off he went to the door. "So you've got here at last," was what he was going to say to Gandalf this time. But it was not Gandalf. Instead, there was a very old-looking dwarf on the step with a white beard and a scarlet hood, and he too hopped inside as soon as the door was opened, just as if he had been invited. "I see they have begun to arrive already," he said when he caught sight of Dwalin's green hood hanging up. He hung his red one next to it, and "Balin, at your service," he said with his hand on his breast. "Thank you," said Bilbo with a gasp. It was not the correct thing to say, but "they have begun to arrive" had flustered him badly. He liked visitors, but he liked to know them before they arrived, and he preferred to ask them himself. He had a horrible thought that the cakes might run short, and then he, as the host, he knew his duty, and stuck to it however painful, he might have to go without. "Come along in and have some tea," he managed to say after taking a deep breath. "A little beer would suit me better if it is all the same to you, my good sir," said Balin with the white beard. "But I don't mind some cake, seed cake if you have any." "Lost!" Bilbo found himself answering to his own surprise, and he found himself scuttling off to the cellar to fill a pint beer mug, and to the pantry to fetch 2 beautiful round seed cakes which he had baked that afternoon for his after-supper morsel. When he got back, Balin and Dwalin were talking at the table like old friends. As a matter of fact, they were brothers. Bilbo plumped down the beer and the cake in front of them, and when loud came a ring at the bell again, and then another ring. "Gandalf for certain this time," he thought as he puffed along the passage. But it was not. It was 2 more dwarves, both with blue hoods, silver belts, and yellow beards, and each of them carried a bag of tools and a spade. In they hopped as soon as the door began to open. Bilbo was hardly surprised at all. "What can I do for you, my dwarves?" he said. "Kili, at your service," said one, and "Fili," added the other, and they both swept off their blue hoods and bowed. "At yours and your families," replied Bilbo, remembering his manners this time. "Dwalin and Balin here already, I see," said Kili. "Let us join the throng." "Throng," thought Mr. Baggins. "I don't like the sound of that. I really must sit for a minute and collect my wits and have a drink." He had only just a sip in the corner while the 4 dwarfs sat round the table and talked about mines and gold and trouble with the goblins and the depredations of dragons and lots of other things which he did not understand and did not want to, for they sounded much too adventurous, when ding-dong-ling-ding, his bell rang again, as if some naughty little hobbit child was trying to pull the handle off. "Someone at the door?" he said, blinking. "Some 4, I should say, by the sound," said Fili. "Besides, we saw them coming along behind us in the distance." The poor little hobbit sat down in the hall and put his head in his hands, and wondered what had happened, and what was going to happen, and whether they would all stay to supper. Then the bell rang again, louder than ever, and he had to run to the door. It was not 4 after all, it was 5. Another dwarf had come along while he was wandering in the hall. He had hardly turned the knob before they were all inside, bowing and saying, "At your service," one after another. Dori, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin were their names, and very soon 2 purple hoods, a grey hood, a brown hood, and a white hood were hanging on the pegs, and off they marched with their broad hands stuck in their gold and silver belts to join the others. already it had almost become a throng. Some called for ale, and some for porter, and one for coffee, and all of them for cakes, so the Hobbit was kept very busy for a while. Another drink break. I would feel very bad if I spilled tea on Gandalf. Also, there's like a little swatch of my bangs that won't stay where it belongs. So I apologize if I'm constantly fiddling with it. All right. Poor Bilbo is stressed. Things are happening. I remember being very distraught as a child. I did not like unexpected things or people in my space, or not knowing what was going on. I still do not like these things, but I was more sensitive to them then, and I was very, very upset for poor Bilbo. A big jug of coffee had just been set in the hearth. The seed cakes were gone, and the dwarfs were starting on a round of buttered scones when there came a loud knock. Not a ring, but a hard rat-tat on the Hobbit's beautiful green door. Somebody was banging with a stick. Bilbo rushed along the passage very angrily, and altogether bewildered and bewuthered. This was the most awkward Wednesday he had ever remembered. He pulled open the door with a jerk, and they all fell in, one on top of the other. More dwarves, 4 more. And there was Gandalf behind, leaning on his staff and laughing. He had made quite a dent on the beautiful door. He had also, by the way, knocked out the secret mark he had put there the morning before. Carefully, carefully, he said. It's not like you, Bilbo, to keep friends waiting on the mat and then open the door like a pop gun. Let me introduce Beaver, Bofer, Bomber, and especially Thorin. At your service, said Beaver, Bofer, and Bomber, standing in a row. Then they hung up 2 yellow hoods and a pale green one, then also a sky blue one with a long silver tassel. This last belonged to Thorin, an enormously important dwarf. In fact, no other than the great Thorin Oakenshield himself, who was not at all pleased at falling flat on Bilbo's mat with Beaver, Bomber, and Bofer on top of him. For one thing, Bomber was immensely fat and heavy. Thorin, indeed, was very haughty and said nothing about service, but poor Mr. Baggins said he was sorry so many times that at last he grunted, "Pray don't mention it," and stopped frowning. Now we are all here, said Gandalf, looking at the row of 13 hoods, the best detachable party hoods, and his own hat hanging on the pegs. Quite a merry gathering. I hope there is something left for the latecomers to eat and drink. What's that? Tea? No, thank you. A little red wine, I think, for me. And for me, said Thorin. And raspberry jam and apple tart, said Beaver. And mince pies and cheese, said Bofer. And pork pie and salad, said Bomber. And more cakes and ale and coffee, if you don't mind, called the other dwarfs through the door. Put on a few eggs, there's a good fellow, Gandalf called after him, as the hobbit stepped off to the pantries, and just bring out the cold chicken and pickles. Seems to know as much about the inside of my larder as I do myself, thought Mr. Baggins, who was feeling positively flummoxed, and was beginning to wonder whether a most wretched adventure had not come right into his house. By the time he had got all the bottles and dishes and knives and forks and glasses and plates and spoons and things piled up on big trays, he was getting very hot and red in the face and annoyed. Confusticate and bebother these dwarves, he said aloud. Why don't they come and lend a hand? Lo and behold, there stood Balin and Dwalin at the door of the kitchen, and Fili and Kili behind them, and before he could say knife, they had whisked the trays and a couple of small tables into the parlor and set everything out afresh. Gandalf sat at the head of the party with the 13 dwarves all round, and Bilbo sat on a stool at the fireside, nibbling at a biscuit. His appetite was quite taken away, and trying to look as if this was all perfectly ordinary and not in the least an adventure. The dwarves ate, and talked, and time got on. At last they pushed their chairs back, and Bilbo made a move to collect the plates and glasses. I suppose you will all stay to supper, he said in his politest, unpressing tones. Of course, said Thorin, and after. We shan't get through the business till late, and we must have some music first. Now to clear up." Thereupon the 12 dwarfs, not Thorin, he was too important and stayed talking to Gandalf, jumped to their feet and made tall piles of all the things. Off they went, not waiting for trays, balancing columns of plates, each with a bottle on the top, with one hand, while the hobbit ran after them, almost squeaking with fright. "Please be careful, and please don't trouble, I can manage." But the dwarves only started to sing. "Chip the glasses and crack the plates, blunt the knives and bend the forks, that's what Bilbo Baggins hates, smash the bottles and burn the corks. Cut the cloth and shut on the fat, pour the milk on the pantry floor, leave the bones on the bedroom mat, splash the wine on every door. Dump the crocks in a bowling bowl, pound them up with a thumping pole, and when you're finished, if any are whole, send them down the hall to roll. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates, so carefully, carefully with the plates." And of course they did none of these dreadful things, and everything was cleaned and put away as safe and quick as lightning, while the hobbit was turning round and round in the middle of the kitchen, trying to see what they were doing. Then they went back and found Thorin with his feet on the fender, smoking a pipe. He was blowing the most enormous smoke rings, and whenever he told one to go, it went. Up the chimney, or behind the clock on the mantelpiece, or under the table, or round and round the ceiling. But wherever it went, it was not quick enough to escape Gandalf. Pop! He sent a smaller smoke ring from his short clay pipe straight through each one of Thorin's. Then Gandalf's smoke ring would go green and come back to hover over the wizard's head. He had quite a cloud of them about him already, and in the dim light it made him look strange and sorcerous. Bilbo stood still and watched. He loved smoke rings. And then he blushed to think how proud he had been yesterday morning of the smoke rings he had sent up the wind over the hill. "Now for some music," said Thorin. "Bring out the instruments." Keely and Feely rushed for their bags and brought back little fiddles. Dori, Nori, and Ori brought out flutes from somewhere inside their coats. Bomber produced a drum from the hall. Beaver and Bofer went out too, and then came back with clarinets that they had left among the walking sticks. Dwalin and Balin said, "Excuse me, I left mine in the porch." "Just bring mine in with you," said Thorin. They came back with vials as big as themselves, and with Thorin's harp wrapped in a green cloth. It was a beautiful golden harp, and when Thorin struck it, the music began all at once, so sudden and sweet that Bilbo forgot everything else and was swept away into dark lands under strange moons, far over the water and very far from his hobbit hole under the hill. The dark came into the room from the little window that opened in the side of the hill. The firelight flickered, it was April, and still they played on while the shadow of Gandalf's beard wagged against a wall. The dark filled all the room, and the fire died down, and the shadows were lost, and still they played on. And suddenly first one and then another began to sing as they played, deep-throated singing of the dwarves in the deep places of their ancient homes, and this is like a fragment of their song, if it can be like their song without their music. "Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away a break of day, to seek the pale enchanted gold. The dwarves of yore made mighty spells, while hammers fell like ringing bells, in places deep where dark things sleep, in hollow halls beyond the fells. For ancient king and elven lord, there many a gleaming golden hoard, they shaped and wrought and light they caught, to hide in gems on hilt of sword, on silver necklaces they strung, the flowering stars on crowns they hung, the dragon fire and twisted wire, they meshed the light of moon and sun. Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day, to claim our long forgotten gold. Goblets they carved there for themselves, and harps of gold where no man delves. there lay they long, and many a song was sung unheard by men or elves. The pines were roaring on the height, the winds were moaning in the night. The fire was red, it flaming spread, the trees like torches blazed with light. The bells were ringing in the dale, and men looked up with faces pale. The dragon's ire, more fierce than fire, laid low their towers and houses frail. The mountains smoked beneath the moon, the dwarves they heard the tramp of doom. They fled their hall to dying fall, beneath his feet, beneath the moon. Far over the misty mountains grim, to dungeons deep and caverns dim, we must away ere break of day, to win our harps and gold from him. As they sang, the hobbit felt the love of beautiful things made by hands and by cunning and by magic moving through him. A fierce and jealous love, the desire of the hearts of dwarves. Then something tookish woke up inside him, and he wished to go and see the great mountains and hear the pine trees and the waterfalls and explore the caves and wear a sword instead of a walking stick. He looked out the window. The stars were out in a dark sky above the trees. He thought of the jewels of the dwarves shining in dark caverns. Suddenly, in the wood beyond the water, a flame leapt up, probably somebody lighting a wood fire, and he thought of plundering dragons settling on his quiet hill and kindling it all to flames. He shuddered, and very quickly he was plain Mr. Baggins of Bag End Under Hill again. I think that's a good moment for a drink break. Oop. I do have an entire pot of tea here for refill purposes. It is quite delicious. Reading about all this yummy food has made me want to eat some. I will also say one of my favorite parts of hearing this read aloud in my youth was that my mom made up the tunes as she went. She is a talented musician and would just read, and then when she hit the words would come up with the song, and that would be that. So some of them I just remember from being a child, but for some of them I could not think of the tune, especially since there was like a tune written for the movie that had just sort of overwritten it in my head. So I did video call my mom and see if she could remember the tune, and she didn't know it from memory, but that is what she came up with from just looking at the book and seeing what came to mind. So that is the most authentic version of the experience you can get without going back to like 2001. I will say that's what Bilbo Baggins hates, is a little bit Howard Shore inspired, but I'll take it. Now the Hobbit is brought along by the lure of the song and wanting to go on an adventure, but then quite remembers why he doesn't do such things, and sort of shuts himself back down. And there he lays. Okay. He got up, trembling. He had less than half a mind to fetch the lamp, and more than half a mind to pretend to, and go and hide behind the beer barrels in the cellar, and not come out again until all the dwarves had gone away. Suddenly he found that the music and the singing had stopped, and they were all looking at him with eyes shining in the dark. "Where are you going?" said Thorin, in a tone that seemed to show he had guessed both halves of the hobbit's mind. "What about a little light?" said Bilbo apologetically. "We like the dark," said the dwarves. "Dark for dark business. There are many hours before dawn." "Of course," said Bilbo, and sat down in a hurry. He missed the stool and sat in the fender, knocking over the poker and shovel with a crash. "Hush!" said Gandalf. "Let Thorin speak." And this is how Thorin began. "Gandalf, dwarves, and Mr. Baggins, we are met together in the house of our friend and fellow conspirator, this most excellent and audacious hobbit. May the hair on his toes never fall out, all praise to his wine and ale." He paused for a breath and for a polite remark from the hobbit. But the compliments were quite lost on poor Bilbo Baggins, who was wagging his mouth at protest at being called audacious and, worst of all, fellow conspirator, so no noise came out, he was so flummoxed. So Thorin went on. "We are met to discuss our plans, our ways, means, policy, and devices. We shall soon, before the break of day, start on our long journey, a journey from which some of us, or perhaps all of us, except our friend and counselor, the ingenious wizard Gandalf, may never return. It is a solemn moment. Our object is, I take it, well known to us all. To the estimable Mr. Baggins, and perhaps to one or two of the younger dwarves, I think I should be right in naming Keely and Feely, for instance, the exact situation at the moment may require a little brief explanation." This was Thorin's style. He was an important dwarf. If he had been allowed, he would probably have gone on like this until he was out of breath without telling anyone there anything that was not known already. But he was rudely interrupted. Poor Bilbo couldn't bear it any longer. At "may never return," he felt to feel a shriek coming up inside, and very soon it burst out like the whistle of an engine coming out of a tunnel. All the dwarfs sprang up, knocking over the table. Gandalf struck a blue light on the end of his magic staff, and in its firework glare the poor little hobbit could be seen kneeling on the hearthrug, shaking like a jelly that was melting. Then he fell flat on the floor and kept on calling out, "Struck by lightning! Struck by lightning!" over and over again, and that was all they could get out of him for a long time. So they took him and laid him out of the way on the drawing-room sofa, with a drink at his elbow, and they went back to their dark business. "Excitable little fellow," said Gandalf as they sat down again. "Gets funny odd fits, but he's one of the best, as fierce as a dragon in a pinch." If you have ever seen a dragon in a pinch, you will realize that this was only poetical exaggeration applied to any hobbit, even to old Took's great-granduncle Bull Roarer, who was so huge, for a hobbit, that he could ride a horse. He charged the ranks of the goblins of Mount Graham in the Battle of the Green Fields, and knocked their king Gomfinbill's head clean off with a wooden club. It sailed 100 yards through the air and went down a rabbit hole, and in this way the battle was won and the game of golf invented at the same moment. I love that bit. I quote this often, and most times people don't know what I'm talking about. It's very weird, it's very specific, but I'm just delighted by, in this way the battle was won and the game of golf invented in the same moment. Also, hello to Rick World News. I hope all is well for you and yours today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this stream. I may take a break at 3 to do like announcements and stuff. I've been thinking about a slightly, oh boy, goodbye candle, that's very hot. I've been thinking about a slightly redone format by which some of the important stuff goes in the middle instead of the end, because usually I'm a little rushed near the end. But that does require me to remember what the important stuff is, so we'll see what happens once we get to 3. Anyway, the game of golf was invented. In the meanwhile, however, Bull Roarer's gentler descendant was reviving in the drawing room. After a while and a drink, he crept nervously to the door of the parlor. This is what he heard. Gloin speaking, "Humph," or something more or less like that. "Will he do you think? It is all very well for Gandalf to talk about this hobbit being fierce, but one shriek like that in a moment of excitement would be enough to wake the dragon and all his relatives and kill the lot of us. I think it sounded more like fright than excitement. In fact, if it had not been for the sign on the door, I should have been sure we had come to the wrong house. As soon as I clapped eyes on the little fellow bobbing and puffing on the mat, I had my doubts. He looks more like a grocer than a burglar." Then Mr. Baggins turned the handle and went in. The Took side had won. He suddenly felt he would go without bed and breakfast to be thought fierce. As for little fellow bobbing on the mat, it almost made him really fierce. Many a time afterward, the Baggins part regretted what he did now, and he would say to himself, "Bilbo, you were a fool. You walked right in and put your foot in it." "Pardon me," he said, if I have overheard words that you were saying. I don't pretend to understand what you are talking about or your reference to burglars, but I think I am right in believing," this is what he called being on his dignity, "that you think I am no good. I will show you I have no signs on my door. It was painted a week ago, and I am quite sure you have come to the wrong house. As soon as I saw your funny faces on the doorstep, I had my doubts. But treat it as the right one. Tell me what you want done, and I will try it. If I have to walk from here to the east of East and fight the wild were-worms in the last desert, I had a great-great-great-granduncle once, Bulwer Took, and—" "Yes, but that was long ago," said Gloin. "I was talking about you, and I assure you there is a mark on this door, the usual one in the trade, or used to be. Burglar wants a good job, plenty of excitement, and reasonable reward. That's how it is usually read. You can say expert treasure hunter instead of burglar if you like. Some of them do. It's all the same to us. Gandalf told us that there was a man of the sort in these parts looking for a job at once, and that he had arranged for a meeting here this Wednesday tea-time." "Of course there is a mark," said Gandalf. "I put it there myself, for very good reasons. You asked me to find the 14th man for your expedition, and I chose Mr. Baggins. Just let anyone say I chose the wrong man or the wrong house, and you can stop at 13 and have the bad luck you like, or go back to digging coal." He scowled so angrily at Gloin that the dwarf huddled back in his chair, and when Bilbo tried to open his mouth to ask a question, he turned and frowned at him and stuck out his bushy eyebrows, till Bilbo shut his mouth tight with a snap. "That's right," said Gandalf. "Let's have no more argument. I have chosen Mr. Baggins, and that ought to be enough for all of you. If I say he is a burglar he is, or will be when the time comes. There is a lot more in him than you guess, and a deal more than he has any idea of himself. You may, possibly, all live to thank me yet. Now, Bilbo, my boy, fetch the lamp and let's have a little light on this." On the table, in the light of a big lamp with a red shade, he spread a piece of parchment rather like a map. "This was made by Thror, your grandfather, Thorin," he said in answer to the dwarves' excited questions. "It is a plan of the mountains." "I don't see that this will help us much," said Thorin disappointedly after a glance. "I remember the mountain well enough and the lands about it, and I know where Mirkwood is and the Withered Heath and where the great dragons bred." "There is a dragon marked in red on the mountain," said Balin, "but it will be easy enough to find him without that if we ever arrive there." "There is one point that you haven't noticed," said the wizard, "and that is the secret entrance. You see that rune on the west side and the hand pointing to it from the other runes? That marks a hidden passage to the lower halls." "It may have been a secret once," said Thorin, "but how do we know that it is a secret any longer? Old Smaug has lived there long enough now to find out anything there is to know about those caves." "He may, but he can't have used it for years and years." "Why?" "Because it is too small. 5 feet high the door, and 3 may walk abreast, say the runes, but Smaug could not creep into a hole that size, not even when he was a young dragon, certainly not after devouring so many of the dwarves and men of Dale." "It seems a great big hole to me," squeaked Bilbo, who had no experience of dragons and only of hobbit holes. He was getting excited and interested again, so that he forgot to keep his mouth shut. He loved maps, and in his hall there hung a large one of the country road with all his favorite walks marked on it in red ink. How could such a large door be kept secret from everybody outside, apart from the dragon? He asked. He was only a little hobbit, you must remember. Also, hello to Remulternus. And I'm sorry to hear that you have also gotten sick, Rick. That is a big bummer. I will turn to the map at the beginning of this book for your enjoyment. If I can find it. I remember staring at this map greatly with J.R. Tolkien's little dragon doodle in there and trying to figure out where everything was. I find it quite charming. And I learned how to draw runes. I think that was from a Dragonology book, though. Boy. Dragonology was where it was at. Alright, back to the story. Enjoy your map. Bilbo likes maps. He was only a little hobbit. In lots of ways, said Gandalf, but in what way this one has been hidden we don't know without going to see. From what it says on the map, I should guess there is a closed door which has been made to look exactly like the side of the mountain. That is the usual dwarves' method. I think that's right, isn't it? Quite right, said Thorin. Also, went on Gandalf, I forgot to mention that with the map went a key, a small and curious key. Here it is, he said, and handed to Thorin a key with a long barrel and intricate wards made of silver. Keep it safe. Indeed I will, said Thorin, and he fastened it upon a fine chain that hung about his neck and under his jacket. Now things begin to look more hopeful. This news alters them too much for the better. So far, we have no clear idea of what to do. We thought of going east, as quiet and careful as we could, as far as the Long Lake. After that, the trouble would begin. A long time before that, if I know anything about the road east, interrupted Gandalf. We might go from there up the river running, went on Thorin, taking no notice, and so to the ruins of Dale, the old towns in the valley there under the shadow of the mountain. But none of us liked the idea of the front gate. The river runs right out of it through the great cliff at the south of the mountain, and out of it comes the dragon too. Far too often, unless he is changed. That would be no good, said the wizard, not without a mighty warrior, even a hero. I tried to find one, but warriors are busy fighting one another in distant lands, and in this neighborhood heroes are scarce or simply not to be found. Swords in these parts are mostly blunt, and axes are used for trees, and shields as cradles or dish covers, and dragons are comfortably far off, and therefore legendary. That is why I settled on burglary, especially when I remembered the existence of a side door. And here is our little Bilbo Baggins, the burglar, the chosen and selected burglar. So now let's get on and make some plans. Very well then, said Thorin. Supposing the burglar expert give us some ideas or suggestions? He turned with mock politeness to Bilbo. First, I should like to know a bit more about things, said he, feeling all confused and a bit shaky inside, but so far still tookishly determined to go on with things. I mean about the gold and the dragon and all that, and how it got there, and who it belongs to, and so on and further. Bless me, said Thorin, haven't you got a map? And didn't you hear our song? And haven't we been talking about all of this for hours? All the same, I should like it all plain and clear, said he obstinately, putting on his business manner, usually reserved for people who tried to borrow money off him, and doing his best to appear wise and prudent and professional and live up to Gandalf's recommendation. Also, I should like to know about risks, out-of-pocket expenses, time required, and remuneration, and so forth, by which he meant, what am I going to get out of it, and am I going to come back alive? Oh, very well, said Thorin. Long ago, in my grandfather Thror's time, our family was driven out of the far north, and came back with all their wealth and their tools to this mountain on the map. It had been discovered by my far ancestor, Thrain the Old, but they mined and they tunneled and they made huger halls and greater workshops, and in addition I believe they found a good deal of gold and a great many jewels too. Anyway, they grew immensely rich and famous, and my father was king under the mountain again, and treated with great reverence by the mortal men who lived to the south, and were gradually spreading up the running river as far as the valley overshadowed by the mountain. They built the merry town of Dale there in those days. Kings used to send for our smiths and reward even the least skillful most richly. fathers would beg us to take their sons as apprentices and pay us handsomely, especially in food supplies, which we never bothered to grow or find for ourselves. Altogether, those were good days for us, and the poorest of us had money to spend and to lend, and leisure to make beautiful things just for the fun of it, not to speak of the most marvelous and magical toys, the like of which is not to be found in the world nowadays. So my grandfather's halls became full of armor and jewels and carvings and cups, and the toy market of Dale was the wonder of the north. Undoubtedly, that was what brought the dragon. Dragons steal gold and jewels, you know, from men and elves and dwarves, wherever they can find them, and they guard their plunder as long as they live, which is practically forever unless they are killed, and never enjoy a brass ring of it. Indeed, they hardly know a good bit of work from a bad, though they usually have a good notion of the current market value, and they can't make a thing for themselves, not even mend a little loose scale of their armor. There were lots of dragons in the north in those days, and gold was probably getting scarce up there, with all the dwarves flying south or getting killed, and all the general waste and destruction that dragons make, going from bad to worse. There was a most especially greedy, strong, and wicked worm called Smog. One day he flew up into the air and came south. The first we heard of it was a noise like a hurricane coming from the north, and the pine trees of the mountain creaking and cracking in the wind. Some of the dwarves who happened to be outside, I was one, luckily, a fine adventurous lad in those days, always wandering about, and it saved my life that day. Well, from a good way off, we saw the dragon settle on our mountain in a spout of flame. Then he came down the slopes, and when he reached the woods, they all went up in fire. By that time, all the bells were ringing in Dale, and the warriors were arming. The dwarves rushed out of their great gate, but there was the dragon waiting for them. None escaped that way. The river rushed up in steam, and a fog fell on Dale, and in the fog the dragon came on them and destroyed most of the warriors. The usual unhappy story. It was only too common in these days. Then he went back and crept in through the front gate, and routed out the halls and lanes and tunnels, alleys, cellars, mansions, and passages. After that there were no dwarves left alive inside, and he took all their wealth for himself. Probably, for that is the dragon's way, he has piled it all up in a great heap far inside, and sleeps on it for a bed. Later, he used to crawl out of the great gate and come by night to Dale, and carry away people, especially maidens, to eat, until Dale was ruined and all the people dead or gone. What goes on there now, I don't know for certain, but I don't suppose anyone lives nearer to the mountain than the far edge of the long lake nowadays. Wow, Thorn talks a lot. All right, let's go. Now, the few of us that were well outside sat and wept in hiding and cursed Smog, and they were unexpectedly joined by my father and my grandfather with singed beards. They looked very grim, but they said very little. When I asked how they had got away, they told me to hold my tongue, and said that one day in the proper time I should know. And that we went away, and we have had to earn our living as best we could up and down the lands, often enough sinking as low as blacksmith work or even coal mining. But we have never forgotten our stolen treasure. And even now, when I will allow we have had a good bit laid by and are not so badly off, here Thorn stroked the gold chain round his neck, we still mean to get it back, to bring our curses home to Smog, if we can. I have often wondered about my father's and my grandfather's escape. I see now that they must have had a private side door which only they knew about. But apparently they made a map, and I should like to know how Gandalf got a hold of it, and why it did not come down to me, the rightful heir. I did not get a hold of it. I was given it, said the wizard. Your grandfather Thror was killed, you remember, in the mines of Moria by Zog the Goblin. Curse his name, yes, said Thorin. And Thrain, your father, went away on the 21st of April 100 years ago last Thursday, and has never been seen by you since. True, true, said Thorin. Well, your father gave me this to give to you, and I have chosen my own time and way for handing it over. You can hardly blame me, considering the trouble I had to find you. Your father could not remember his own name when he gave me the paper, and he never told me yours. So on the whole, I think I ought to be praised and thanked. Here it is, he said, handing them out to Thorin. I don't understand, said Thorin, and Bilbo felt he would have liked to say the same. The explanation did not seem to explain. Your grandfather, said the wizard slowly and grimly, gave the map to his son for safety before he went to the mines of Moria. Your father went away to try his luck with the map after your grandfather was killed, and lots of adventures of a most unpleasant sort he had, but he never got near the mountain. How he got there, I don't know, but I found him a prisoner in the dungeons of the necromancer. Whatever were you doing there? Asked Thorn with a shudder, and all the dwarves shivered. Never you mind. I was finding things out, as usual, and a nasty, dangerous business it was. Even I, Gandalf, only just escaped. I tried to save your father, but it was too late. He was witless and wandering, and had forgotten almost everything except the map and the key. We have long ago paid the goblins of Moria, said Thorin. We must give a thought to the necromancer. Don't be absurd. He is an enemy quite beyond the powers of all the dwarves put together if they could all be collected again from the four corners of the world. The one thing your father wished was for his son to read the map and use the key. The dragon and the mountain are more than big enough tasks for you. Hear, hear, said Bilbo, and accidentally said it aloud. Hear what? They all said, turning suddenly toward him, and he was so flustered that he answered, Hear what I have to say. What's that? They asked. Well, I should say that you ought to go east and have a look round. After all, there is the side door, and dragons must sleep sometimes, I suppose. If you sit on the doorstep long enough, I dare say you will think of something. And, well, don't you know, I think we have talked long enough for one night, if you see what I mean. What about bed and an early start and all that? I will give you a good breakfast before you go. Before we go, I suppose you mean, said Thorin. Aren't you the burglar? And isn't sitting on the doorstep your job, not to speak of getting inside the door? But I agree about bed and breakfast. I like 6 eggs with my ham when starting on a journey, fried not poached, and mind you don't break 'em. After all the others had ordered their breakfasts without so much as a please, which annoyed Bilbo very much, they all got up. The Hobbit had to find room for them all, and filled his spare rooms and made beds on chairs and sofas before he got them all stowed and went to his own little bed, very tired and not altogether happy. One thing he did make up his mind about was not to bother to get up very early and cook everyone's wretched breakfast. The tookishness was wearing off, and he was now not quite so sure that he was going on any journey in the morning. As he lay in bed, he could hear Thorin still humming to himself in the best bedroom next to him. Bilbo went to sleep with that in his ears, and it gave him very uncomfortable dreams. It was long after the break of day when he woke up. I'm going to use Gandalf as a bookmark and take a short break. Oh, that is quite lovely. I forgot how enjoyable that book is. Though there is quite a bit in the middle that's Thorin explains things. Oh boy. And Gandalf argues about stuff. I do have, as I'm experimenting with, some middle of the stream updates. So today is the 25th. Now through the 31st, which is Transgender Day of Visibility. Any lovely trans folks in the community around me and fiber arts and nerdiness and all that goodness are welcome to share a bit of their story and themselves if they feel comfortable. And there's going to be a bit of a trans takeover on my social media feeds and all of that come the 31st. So if you want to participate in that, or you know folks who would be interested, do share. The link is probably in the description. If not, you can go to my link tree, which is linktur.ee/JanateeCraftily. And it is on many social media as well. I'm very excited about that. I've gotten some really lovely submissions. I like it especially when people post photos of, like, faces are great, but also posting photos of, like, here is my dog, or here is my project, or here is, like, something that makes me excited. I just really enjoy that as an alternative to the traditional, like, profile picture thing. No one has sent me an image of an NFT, which is great. Oh man, I don't know what I would do with that. I post it, I guess. Who knows? But that is happening through the very same day, because it is the end of March. All of my Disney adjacent / inspired products in my Etsy shop, half the profits are going to go to Equality Florida to fight a little thing called the Don't Say Gay bill you might have heard of, whose legislators are financially supported by Disney. So I figured I might as well, just I don't know quite how to put that, but it felt like a good thing to do. So if you are interested in, I don't know, Encanto or Star Wars or Marvel or anything along those lines, and you're feeling funky about the Don't Say Gay stuff, that is a good way to fuel both of those things without fueling Disney. Trying to think of other things. Usually I have stuff in front of me for this part. Those are the two big ones. You all are lovely, and I think I will take a drink break and continue the stream. Do let me know how y'all are doing on this fine Friday. I see we got a handful of folks in the chat saying hi and all that jazz. I hope things are well. And if you are drinking tea or anything of the sort, let me know what it is. Real talk, I also think I'm going to take a bathroom break because I have been inhaling lots of tea. If folks come in and are confused, please let them know. All right, time for chapter 2. There you go, little buddy. Chapter 2, Roast Mutton. Up jumped Bilbo, and putting on his dressing gown, went into the dining room. There he saw nobody but all the signs of a large and hurried breakfast. There was a fearful mess in the room, and piles of unwashed crocks in the kitchen. Nearly every pot and pan he possessed seemed to have been used. The washing up was so dismally real that Bilbo was forced to believe the party of the night before had not been part of his bad dreams, as he had rather hoped. Indeed, he was really relieved after all to think that it had all gone up without him, without bothering to wake him up. But with never a thank you, he thought. And yet, in a way, he could not help feeling just a trifle disappointed. The feeling surprised him. "Don't be a fool, Bilbo Baggins," he said to himself, thinking of dragons and all that outlandish nonsense at your age. So he put on an apron, lit fires, boiled water, and washed up. Then he had a nice little breakfast in the kitchen before turning out the dining room. By that time the sun was shining and the front door was open, letting in a warm spring breeze. Bilbo began to whistle loudly and to forget about the night before. In fact, he was just sitting down to a nice little second breakfast in the dining room by the open window, when in walked Gandalf. "My dear fellow," said he, "whenever are you going to come? What about an early start? And here you are having breakfast, or whatever you call it, at 10:30. They left you the message because they could not wait." "What message?" said poor Mr. Baggins, all in a fluster. "Great elephants," said Gandalf, "you are not at all yourself this morning. You have never dusted the mantelpiece." "What's that got to do with it? I've had enough to do with washing up for 14. If you had dusted the mantelpiece, you would have noticed this just under the clock," said Gandalf, handing Bilbo a note, written, of course, on his own notepaper. This is what he read. "Thorin and Company to Burglar Bilbo. Greeting! For your hospitality our sincerest thanks, and for your offer of professional assistance our grateful acceptance. Terms: cash on delivery up to and not exceeding 1/14 of total profits, if any. All traveling expenses guaranteed in any event. Funeral expenses to be defrayed by us or our representatives if occasion arises and the matter is not otherwise arranged for. Thinking it unnecessary to disturb your esteemed repose, we have proceeded in advance to make requisite preparations, and shall await your respected person at the Green Dragon Inn, Bywater, at 11 a.m. sharp. Trusting that you will be punctual, we have the honor to remain, yours deeply, Thorin and Co." "That leaves you just 10 minutes. You'll have to run," said Gandalf. "But," said Bilbo. "No time for it," said the wizard. "But," said Bilbo again. "No time for that either. Off you go." To the end of his days, Bilbo could never remember how he found himself outside, without a hat, walking stick, or any money, or anything that he usually took when he went out, leaving his second breakfast half finished and quite unwashed up, pushing his keys into Gandalf's hands, and running as fast as his furry feet could take him down the lane, past the great mill, across the water, and then on for a whole mile or more. Very puffed he was when he got to Bywater just on the stroke of 11, and found that he had come without a pocket-handkerchief. "Bravo!" said Balin, who was standing at the inn door looking out for him. Just then all the others came round the corner of the road from the village. They were on ponies, and each pony was slung about with all kinds of baggages, packages, parcels, and paraphernalia. It was a very small pony, apparently for Bilbo. "Up you two, get, and off we go," said Thorin. "I'm awfully sorry," said Bilbo, "but I have come without my hat, and I have left my pocket-handkerchief behind, and I haven't got any money. I didn't get your note until after 10:45 to be precise." "Don't be precise," said Dwalin, "and don't worry. You'll have to manage without pocket-handkerchiefs and a good many other things before you get on to the journey's end. As for a hat, I've got a spare hood and cloak in my luggage." That's how they all came to start, jogging off from the inn one fine morning just before May, on laden ponies, and Bilbo was wearing a dark green hood, a little weather-stained, and a dark green cloak borrowed from Dwalin. They were too large for him, and he looked rather comic. What his father Bungo would have thought of him, I daren't think. His only comfort was that he couldn't be mistaken for a dwarf, as he had no beard. They had not been riding very long, when up came Gandalf, very splendid, on a white horse. He had brought a lot of pocket-handkerchiefs and Bilbo's pipe and tobacco. So after that the party went along very merrily, and they told stories or sang songs as they rode forward all day, except, of course, when they stopped for meals. These didn't come quite as often as Bilbo would have liked them, but still he began to feel that adventures were not so bad after all. At first they had passed through Hobbit lands, a wild, respectable country, inhabited by decent folk with good roads, an inn or two, and now and then a dwarf or a farmer ambling by on business. Then they came to lands where people spoke strangely, and sang songs Bilbo had never heard before. Now they had gone on far into the lone lands, where there were no people left, no inns, and the roads grew steadily worse. Not far ahead were dreary hills, rising higher and higher, dark with trees. On some of them were old castles with an evil look, as if they had been built by wicked people. Everything seemed gloomy, for the weather that day had taken a nasty turn. Mostly it had been as good as May can be, even in merry tales, but now it was cold and wet. In the lowlands they had to camp when they could, but at least it had been dry. "To think it will soon be June," grumbled Bilbo as he splashed along behind the others in a very muddy track. It was after tea time. It was pouring with rain, and had been all day. His hood was dripping into his eyes, his cloak was full of water, the pony was tired and stumbled on stones, and the others were too grumpy to talk. "And I'm sure the rain has gotten into the dry clothes and into the food bags," thought Bilbo. "Bother burglaring and everything to do with it. I wish I was at home in my nice hole by the fire with the kettle just beginning to sing." It was not the last time he had wished that. Still the dwarves jogged on, never turning round, taking any notice of the hobbit. Somewhere behind the gray clouds the sun must have gone down, for it began to get dark. Wind got up, and the willows along the river bank bent and sighed. I don't know what river it was, a rushing red one, swollen with the rain of the last few days, that came down from the hills and mountains in front of them. Soon it was nearly dark. The winds broke up the gray clouds, and a waning moon appeared above the hills between the flying rags. Then they stopped, and Thorin muttered something about supper. "Where shall we get a dry patch to sleep on?" Not until then did they notice that Gandalf was missing. So far he had come all the way with them, never saying if he was in the adventure or merely keeping them company for a while. He had eaten most, talked most, and laughed most, but now he was simply not there at all. "Just when a wizard would have been most useful, too," groaned Dori and Nori, who shared the hobbit's view about regular meals plenty and often. They decided in the end that they would have to camp where they were. So far they had not camped before on this journey, and though they knew that they soon would have to camp regularly when they were among the misty mountains and far from the land of respectable people, it seemed a bad, wet evening to begin on. They moved to a clump of trees, and though it was drier under them, the wind shook the rain off the leaves, and the drip-drip was most annoying. Also, the mischief seemed to have gotten into the fire. Dwarfs can make a fire almost anywhere, out of almost anything, wind or no wind, but they could not do it that night. Not even Oin and Gloin, who were especially good at it. Then one of the ponies took fright and bolted. He got into the river before they could catch him, and before they could get him out again, Fili and Kili were nearly drowned, and all the baggage that he carried was washed away off him. Of course it was mostly food, and there was mighty little left for supper, and less for breakfast. There they all sat, glum and wet and muttering, while Oin and Gloin went on trying to light the fire and quarreling about it. Bilbo was sadly reflecting that adventurers are not all pony riders and May sunshine when Balin, who was always their lookout man, said, "There's a light over there." There was a hill some ways off with trees on it, pretty thick in parts. Out of the dark mass of the trees they could now see a light shining, a reddish, comfortable-looking light, as it might be a fire or torches twinkling. When they had looked at it for some while, they fell to arguing. Some said no, and some said yes. Some said they could but go and see, and anything was better than little supper, less breakfast, and wet clothes all the night. Others said these parts are none too well known, and are too near the mountains. Travelers seldom come this way now. The old maps are no use, things have changed for the worse, and the road is unguarded. They have seldom ever heard of the king round here, and the less inquisitive you are as you go along, the less trouble you are likely to find. Some said, "After all, there are 14 of us." Others said, "Where has Gandalf got to?" This remark was repeated by everybody. Then the rain began to pour down worse than ever, and Oin and Gloin began to fight. Drink break. Oop. I'm quite enjoying this. I forgot about many of the story beats that happened in this book. It's lovely. Alright, so they're in a fight. That settled it. "After all, we've got a burglar with us," they said, and so they made off, leading their ponies, with all due and proper caution, in the direction of the light. They came to the hill and were soon in the wood. Up the hill they went, but there was no proper path to be seen, such as might lead to a house or a farm, and do what they could. They made a deal out of rustling and crackling and creaking, and a good deal of grumbling and dratting, as they went through the trees in the pitch dark. Suddenly the red light shone out very bright through the tree trunks not far ahead. "Now it is the burglar's turn," they said, meaning Bilbo. "You must go on and find out all about that light, and what it is for, and if it is all perfectly safe and canny," said Thorin to the hobbit. "Now scuttle off and come back quick if all is well. If not, come back if you can. If you can't, hoot twice like a barn owl and once like a screech owl, and we will do what we can." Off Bilbo had to go, before he could explain that he could not hoot even once like any kind of owl any more than fly like a bat. But at any rate, hobbits can move quietly in woods, absolutely quietly. They take pride in it, and Bilbo had sniffed more than once at what he called all this dwarvish racket as they went along, though I don't suppose you and I would notice anything at all on a windy night, not if the whole cavalcade had passed 2 feet off. As for Bilbo walking primly toward the red light, I don't suppose even a weasel would have stirred a whisker at it. So, naturally, he got right up to the fire, for fire it was, without disturbing anyone. And this is what he saw. 3 very large persons sitting round a very large fire of beech logs. They were toasting mutton on long spits of wood and licking the gravy off their fingers. There was a fine, toothsome smell. Also, there was a barrel of good drink at hand, and they were drinking out of jugs. But they were trolls. Obviously trolls. Even Bilbo, in spite of his sheltered life, could see that, from the great heavy faces of them and their size and the shape of their legs, not to mention their language, which was not drawing-room fashion at all. "Mutton yesterday, mutton today, and blimey if it don't look like mutton again tomorrow," said one of the trolls. "Never a blinkin' bit of man-flesh have we for long enough," said a second. "What the 'ell William was a-thinking of to bring us into these parts at all beats me, and the drink running short, what's more," he said, jogging the elbow of William, who was taking a pull at his jug. William choked. "Shut your mouth," he said as soon as he could. "You can't expect folk to stop here forever just to be 'it by you and Bert. You've had a village and a half between you since we came down from the mountains. How much more do you want? And time been up our way when you'd have said, 'Thank yer, Bill, for a nice bit o' fat belly mutton like what this is.'" He took a big bite off a sheep's leg he was toasting, and wiped his lips on his sleeve. Yes, I am afraid trolls do behave like that, even those with only 1 head each. After hearing all this, Bilbo ought to have done something at once. Either he should have gone back quietly and warned his friends that there were 3 fair-sized trolls at hand in a nasty mood, quite likely to try toasted dwarf or even pony for a change, or else he should have done a good bit of quick burgling. A really first-class and legendary burglar would at this point have picked the trolls' pockets. It is nearly always worthwhile if you can manage it. Pinched the very mutton off their spits, purloined the beer, and walked off without their noticing him. Others, more practical but with less professional pride, would perhaps have stuck a dagger into each of them before they observed it. Then the night could have spent cheerily. Bilbo knew it. He had read of a good many things he had never seen or done. He was very much alarmed as well as disgusted. He wished himself 100 miles away, and yet somehow he could not go straight back to Thorin and company empty-handed. So he stood and hesitated in the shadows. Of the various burglarious proceedings he had heard of, picking the troll's pockets seemed the least difficult, so at last he crept behind a tree just behind William. Bert and Tom went off to the barrel. William was having another drink. Then Bilbo plucked up courage and put his little hand in William's enormous pocket. There was a purse in it, as big as a bag to Bilbo. "Ha!" thought he, warming to his new work as he lifted it carefully out. "This is a beginning." It was. Trolls' purses are the mischief, and this was no exception. "Here, who are you?" it squeaked as it left the pocket, and William turned round at once and grabbed Bilbo by the neck before he could duck behind the tree. "Blimey, Bert, look what I've copped," said William. "What is it?" said the others, coming up. "Lumme if I knows. What are you?" "A Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit," said poor Bilbo, shaking all over and wondering how to make the owl noises before they throttled him. "A hobbit?" they said, a bit startled. Trolls are slow in the uptake, and mighty suspicious about anything new to them. "What's a burra hobbit got to do with picking my pocket anyways?" said William. "And can you cook 'em?" said Tom. "You can try," said Bert, picking up a skewer. "He wouldn't make above a mouthful," said William, who had already had a fine supper. "Not when he was skinned and boned." "Perhaps there are more like him round, and we might make a pie," said Bert. "Here, you, are there any more of your sort sneaking in here, Woods, you nasty little rabbit?" "I'm just reading it the way it's written." He said as he looked at the hobbit's furry feet, and he picked him up by the toes and shook him. "Yes, lots," said Bilbo, before he remembered not to give his friends away. "No, none at all, not one," he said immediately afterward. "What do you mean?" said Bert, holding him right away up by the hair this time. "What I say," said Bilbo, gasping, "and please don't cook me, kind sirs. I'm a good cook myself, and cook better than I cook, if you see what I mean. I'll cook beautifully for you, a beautifully beautiful breakfast for you, if only you won't have me for supper." "Poor little blighter," said William. He had already had as much supper as he could hold. Also, he had lots of beer. "Poor little blighter, let him go." "Not till he says what he means by lots and none at all," said Bert. "I don't want to have me throat cut in my sleep. Hold his toads till the fire till he talks." "I won't have it," said William. "I caught him anyway." "You're a fat fool, William," said Bert, "as I've said afore this evening. And you're a lout." "And I won't take that from you, Bill Huggins," said Bert, and put his fist in William's eye. Then there was a gorgeous row. Bilbo had just enough wits left when Bert dropped him on the ground to scramble out of the way of their feet before they were fighting like dogs, and calling one another all sorts of perfectly true and applicable names in very loud voices. Soon they were locked in one another's arms and rolling nearly into the fire, kicking and thumping, while Tom whacked at them both with a branch to bring them to their senses, and that, of course, made them only madder than ever. That would have been the time for Bilbo to have left. But his poor little feet had been very squashed in Bert's big paw, and he had no breath in his body, and his head was going round, so there he lay for a while, panting, just outside the circle of firelight. Right in the middle of the fight came Balin. The dwarfs had heard noises from a distance, and after waiting for some time for Bilbo to come back, or to hoot like an owl, they started off one by one to creep towards the light as quietly as they could. No sooner did Tom see Balin come into the light than he gave an awful howl. Trolls simply detest the very sight of dwarfs, uncooked. Bert and Bill stopped fighting immediately, and, "A sack, Tom, quick!" they said, before Balin, who was wondering where in all this commotion Bilbo was, knew was happening. A sack was over his head, and he was down. "There's more to come yet," said Tom, "or I'm mighty mistook. Lots and none at all it is," said he. "No burra hobbits, but lots of these here dwarves. That's about the shape of it." "I reckon you're right," said Bert, "and we best get out of the light." And so they did. With sacks in their hands that they used for carrying off mutton and other plunder, they waited in the shadows. As each dwarf came up and looked at the fire and the spilled jugs and the gnawed mutton in surprise, pop went a nasty smelly sack over his head, and he was down. Soon Dwalin, led by Balin, and Fili and Kili together, and Dori and Nori and Ori all in a heap, and Oin and Gloin and Bifur and Bofer and Bobber, piled uncomfortably near the fire. "That'll teach 'em," said Tom, for Bifur and Bobber had given a lot of trouble and fought like mad, as dwarfs will when cornered. Thorin came last, and he was not caught unawares. He came expecting mischief, and didn't need to see his friend's legs sticking out of sacks to tell him that things were not all well. He stood outside in the shadows some way off and said, "What's all this trouble? Who has been knocking my people about?" "It's trolls," said Bilbo from behind a tree. They had forgotten all about him. "They're hiding in the bushes with sacks," said he. "Oh, are they?" said Thorin, and he jumped forward to the fire before they could leap onto him. He caught up a big branch on fire at one end, and Bert got that end in his eye before he could step aside. That put him out of the battle for a bit. Bilbo did his best. He caught hold of Tom's leg as well as he could. It was thick as a young tree trunk, but he was sent spinning up into the top of some bushes when Tom kicked the sparks up in Thorin's face. Tom got the branch in his teeth for that and lost one of the front ones. It made him howl, I can tell you. But just at that moment, William came up behind and popped a sack right over Thorin's head and down to his toes. And so the fight ended. A nice pickle they were all in now, all neatly tied up in sacks, with 3 angry trolls, and 2 with burns and bashes to remember, sitting by them, arguing whether they should roast them slowly, or mince them fine and boil them, or just sit on them one by one and squash them into jelly. And Bilbo up in a bush with his clothes and his skin torn, not daring to move for fear they should hear him. It was just then that Gandalf came back. But no one saw him. The trolls had just decided to roast the dwarves now and eat them later. That was Bert's idea, and after a lot of argument they had agreed to it. "No good roasting 'em now, it'll take all night," said a voice. Bert thought it was William's. "Don't start the argument all over again, Bill," he said, "or it will take all night." "Who's arguing?" said William, who thought it was Bert that had spoken. "You are," said Bert. "You're a liar," said William. And so the argument began all over again. In the end, they decided to mince them fine and boil them. So they got a great black pot and they took out their knives. "No good boiling 'em. We ain't got no water, and it's a long way to the well and all," said a voice. Bert and William thought it was Tom's. "Shut up," said they, "or we'll never have done. And you can fetch the water yourself if you say any more." "Shut up yourself," said Tom, who thought it was William's voice. "Who's arguing but you, I'd like to know?" "You're an idiot," said Tom. "Idiot yourself," said William. And so the argument began all over again and went on hotter than ever, until at last they decided to sit on the sacks one by one and squish them, and boil them next time. "Who shall we sit on first?" said the voice. "Better sit on the last fellow first," said Bert, whose eye had been damaged by Thorin. He thought Tom was talking. "Don't talk to yourself," said Tom, "but if he wants to sit on the last one, sit on him. Which is he?" "The one with the yellow stockings," said Bert. "Nonsense, the one with the gray stockings," said a voice like William's. "I made sure it was yellow," said Bert. "Yellow it was," said William. "Then what'd you say it was gray for?" said Bert. "I never did. Tom said it." "That I never did," said Tom. "It was you." "2 to 1, so shut your mouth," said Bert. "Who are you a-talking to?" said William. "Now stop it," said Tom and Bert together. "The night's getting on, and dawn comes early. Let's get on with it." "Dawn take you all and be stoned to you," said a voice that sounded like William's. But it wasn't. For just at that moment the light came over the hill, and there was a mighty twitter in the branches. William never spoke, for he stood turned to stone as he stopped, and Bert and Tom were struck like rocks as they looked at him. And there they stand to this day, all alone, and lets the birds perch on them. For trolls, as you probably know, must be underground before dawn, or they go back to the stuff of the mountains they are made of and never move again. This is what had happened to Bert and Tom and William. "Excellent," said Gandalf as he stepped out from behind a tree and helped Bilbo to climb down out of a thorn bush. Then Bilbo understood. It was the wizard's voice that had kept the trolls bickering and quarreling until the light came and made an end of them. The next thing was to untie the sacks and let out the dwarves. They were nearly suffocated and very annoyed. They had not at all enjoyed lying there listening to the trolls making plans for roasting them and squashing them and mincing them. They had to hear Bilbo's account of what had happened to him twice over before they were satisfied. "Silly time to go practicing pinching and pickpocketing," said Bomber. "What we wanted was fire and food." "And that's just what you wouldn't have got of those fellows without a struggle in any case," said Gandalf. "Anyhow, you are wasting time now. Don't you realize the trolls must have a cave or a hole dug somewhere near to hide from the sun in? We must look for it." They searched about and soon found the marks of trolls' stony boots going away through the trees. They followed the tracks up the hill until, hidden by bushes, they came on a big door of stone leading to a cave. But they could not open it, not though they all pushed while Gandalf tried various incantations. "Would this be any good?" asked Bilbo when they were getting tired and angry. "I found it on the ground where the trolls had their fight." He held out a largish key, though no doubt William had thought it was very small and secret, and must have fallen out of his pocket, very luckily, before he was turned into stone. "Why on earth didn't you mention it before?" they cried. Gandalf grabbed it and fitted it into the keyhole. Then the stone door swung back with one big push, and they all went inside. There were bones on the floor, and a nasty smell was in the air. but there was a good deal of food jumbled carelessly on shelves and on the ground, among an untidy litter of plunder, of all sorts from brass buttons to pots full of gold coins standing in a corner. There were lots of clothes, too, hanging on the walls, too small for trolls. I'm afraid they belonged to victims, and among them were several swords of various makes, shapes, and sizes. Two caught their eyes particularly because of their beautiful scabbards and jeweled hilts. Gandalf and Thorin each took one of these, and Bilbo took a knife in a leather sheath. It would have made only a tiny pocket knife for a troll, but it was as good as a short sword for the hobbit. "These look like good blades," said the wizard, half drawing them and looking at them curiously. "They were not made by any troll, nor by any smith among men in these parts and days, but when we can read the runes on them, we shall know more about them." "Let's get out of this horrible smell," said Fili. So they carried out the pots of coins and such food as was untouched and looked fit to eat, also one barrel of ale which was still full. By that time they felt like breakfast, and being very hungry, they did not turn their noses up at what they had got from the troll's larder. Their own provisions were very scanty. Now they had bread and cheese and plenty of ale, and bacon to toast in the embers of the fire. After they slept, for their night had been disturbed, and they did nothing more till the afternoon. Then they brought up their ponies and carried away the pots of gold and buried them very secretly not far from the track by the river, putting a great many spells over them, just in case they ever had the chance to come back and recover them. When that was done, they mounted once more and jogged along again on the path towards the east. "Where did you go to, if I may ask?" said Thorin to Gandalf as they rode along. "To look ahead," said he. "And what brought you back in the nick of time?" "Looking behind," said he. "Exactly," said Thorin, "but could you be more plain?" "I went out to spy on our road. It will soon become dangerous and difficult. Also, I was anxious about replenishing our small stock of provisions. I had not gone very far, however, when I met a couple of friends of mine from Rivendell." "Where's that?" asked Bilbo. "Don't interrupt," said Gandalf. "You will get there in a few days now, if we're lucky, and find out all about it. As I was saying, I met two of Elrond's people. They were hurrying along for fear of the trolls. It was they who told me that 3 of them had come down from the mountains and settled in the wood not far from the road. They had frightened everyone away from the district, and they waylaid strangers. I immediately had a feeling that I was wanted back. Looking behind, I saw fire in the distance and made for it. So, now you know. Please be more careful next time, or we shall never get anywhere." "Thank you," said Thorin. That's chapter 2. We've got about 20 minutes left in this stream. Oh, and it is no longer as sunny as it once was, but I do want to at least start chapter 3 after some hydration. I'm currently sitting with my legs facing this way, as if I'm like riding a horse side saddle, just because I'm sitting on like an ottoman sort of a thing. One of these days I'm gonna get a proper like desk chair for the stream setup, but it is not to be yet. I still have to get some other stuff first. It is quite lovely reading back through and seeing, I think in particular, like the whimsy of this like fantasy book for children that I really enjoyed, because I think that is the first time, or among the first times I read something that was meant for children, that it was not necessarily speaking down to them. And like the troll bit is genuinely funny. Though I will say it's interesting to see, particularly like reading it out loud, I get a better idea than I would like reading it just with my eyes, of like the pace of things, the tone of sentences, and to see like how much In the past 80 years, writing standards have changed, even from a grammatical standpoint. Semicolons are used so differently, but also the pacing of things and the large chunks of dialogue, and the idea of a dialogue that is just spoken by a they, the dwarves said this, I feel is unusual by today's standards. So it's interesting. I'm gonna take a sip of my tea, and we'll see what's up in Rivendell. I hope we get to the Rivendell song, because I do remember that one from childhood. I will say future streams that involve reading, I will probably only read for 60 to 90 minutes. But I think today was a worthy exception. Chapter 3, Short Rest. They did not sing or tell stories that day, even though the weather improved, nor the next day, nor the day after. They had begun to feel that danger was not far away on either side. They camped under the stars, and their horses had more to eat than they had, for there was plenty of grass. But there was not much in their bags, even with what they had got from the trolls. One morning they forded a river at a wide, shallow place, full of the noises of stones and foam. The far bank was steep and slippery. When they got to the top of it, leading their ponies, they saw that the great mountains had marched down very near to them. Already they seemed only a day's easy journey from the feet of the nearest. Dark and drear it looked, though there were patches of sunlight on its brown sides, and behind its shoulders the tips of snow peaks gleam. "Is that the mountain?" asked Bilbo in a solemn voice, looking at it with round eyes. He had never seen a thing that looked so big before. "Of course not," said Balin. "That is only the beginning of the Misty Mountains, and we have to get through or over or under those somehow before we can come into wilder land beyond. And it is a deal of the way even from the other side of them to the lonely mountain in the east where Smaug lies on our treasure." "Oh," sighed Bilbo, and just at that moment he felt more tired than he ever remembered feeling before. He was thinking once again of his comfortable chair before the fire in his favorite sitting room in his hobbit hole, and of the kettle singing. Not for the last time. Now Gandalf led the way. "We must not miss the road, or else we shall be done for," he said. "We need food, for one thing, and rest in reasonable safety. Also, it is very necessary to tackle the Misty Mountains by the proper path, or else you will get lost in them and have to come back and start at the beginning again, if you ever get back at all." They asked him where he was making for, and he answered, "You are come to the very edge of the wild, and some of you may know, hidden somewhere ahead of us is the fair valley of Rivendell, where Elrond lives in the last homely house. I sent a message by my friends, and we are expected." That sounded nice and comforting, but they had not got there yet, and it was not so easy as it sounds to find the last homely house west of the mountains. There seemed to be no trees and no valley and no hills to break the ground in front of them. Only one vast slope going slowly up and up to meet the feet of the nearest mountain, a wide land the color of heather and crumbling rock, with patches and slashes of grass green and moss green showing where water might be. Morning passed, afternoon came, but in all the silent waste there was no sign of any dwelling. They were growing anxious, for they now saw that a house might be hidden almost anywhere between them and the mountains. They came on unexpected valleys, narrow with deep sides, that opened suddenly at their feet, and they looked down surprised to see trees below them and running water at the bottom. They were gullies that they could almost leap over, but very deep with waterfalls in them. There were dark ravines that one could neither jump nor climb into. There were bogs, some of them green, pleasant places to look at, with flowers growing bright and tall, but a pony that walked there with a pack on his back would never have come out again. It was indeed a much wider land from the ford to the mountains than ever you would have guessed. Bilbo was astonished. The only path was marked with white stones, some of which were small, and others were half covered with moss or heather. Altogether, it was very slow business following the track, even guided by Gandalf, who seemed to know his way about pretty well. His head and beard wagged this way and that as he looked for the stones, and they followed his head, but they seemed no nearer to the end of the search when the day began to fail. Tea time had long gone by, and it seemed supper time would soon do the same. There were moths fluttering about, and the light became very dim, for the moon had not risen. Bilbo's pony began to stumble over roots and stones. They came to the edge of a steep fall in the ground so suddenly that Gandalf's horse nearly slipped down the slope. "Here it is at last," he called, and the others gathered round him and looked over the edge. They saw a valley far below. They could hear the voice of hurrying water and a rocking bed at the bottom. The scent of trees was in the air, and there was a light on the valley side across the water. Bilbo never forgot the way they slithered and slipped in the dusk down the steep zigzag path in the secret valley of Rivendell. The air grew warmer as they got lower, and the smell of the pine trees made him drowsy, so that every now and again he nodded and nearly fell off, or bumped his nose on the pony's neck. Their spirits rose as they went down and down. The trees changed to beech and oak, and there was a comfortable feeling in the twilight. The last green had almost faded out of the grass, when they came at length to an open glade not far above the banks of the stream. It smells like elves," thought Bilbo, and he looked up at the stars. They were burning bright and blue. Just then there came a burst of song like laughter in the trees. "Oh, what are you doing, and where are you going? Your ponies need shoeing, the river is flowing, a tra-la-la-la-lolly, here down in the valley. Oh, what are you seeking, and where are you making? The bundles are reeking, the bannets are baking, oh, trill-la-lil-la-lolly, the valley is jolly. Ha, ha. Oh, where are you going, with beards all a-wagging, no knowing what brings Mr. Baggins and Balin and Dwalin down in the valley in June? Ha, ha. Oh, will you be staying, or will you be flying? Your ponies are straying, the daylight is dying. To fly would be folly, to stay would be jolly. And listen, and hark, to the end of the dark, to our tune, ha, ha." So they laughed and sang in the trees, and pretty fair nonsense, I dare say you think it. Not that they would care. They would only laugh all the more if you told them so. They were elves, of course. Soon Bilbo caught glimpses of them as the darkness deepened. He loved elves, though he seldom met them, but he was a little frightened of them too. Dwarves don't get on well with them. Even decent enough dwarves like Thorin and his friends think them foolish, which is a very foolish thing to think, or get annoyed with them. For some elves tease them and laugh at them, and most of all their beards. "Well, well," said a voice, "just look. Bilbo the Hobbit on a pony, my dear. Isn't it delicious? Most astonishing, wonderful." Then off they went into another song as ridiculous as the one I have written down in full. At last, a tall young fellow came out from the trees and bowed to Gandalf and to Thorin. "Welcome to the valley," he said. "Thank you," said Thorin, a bit gruffly. But Gandalf was already off his horse and among the elves, talking merrily with them. "You are a little out of your way," said the elf. "That is, if you are making for the only path across the water and to the house beyond. We will set you right, but you had best get on foot until you are over the bridge. Are you going to stay a bit and sing with us, or will you go straight on?" "Supper is preparing over there," he said. "I can smell the wood fires for the cooking." Tired as he was, Bilbo would have liked to stay a while. Elvish singing is not a thing to miss in June under the stars, not if you care for such things. Also, he would have liked to have a few private words with these people that seemed to know his name and all about him, although he had never seen them before. He thought their opinion of his adventure might be interesting. Elves know a lot and are wondrous folk for news, and know what is going on among the peoples of the land as quick as water flows, or quicker. But the dwarves were all for supper as soon as possible just then, and would not stay. On they went, leading their ponies, till they were brought to a good path, and so, at last, to the very brink of the river. It was flowing fast and noisily, as mountain streams do of a summer evening. As mountain streams do on a summer evening where sun had been all day on the snow far above. There was only a narrow bridge of stone without a parapet, as narrow as a pony could walk well on, and over that they had to go, slow and careful, one by one, each leading his pony by the bridle. The elves had brought bright lanterns to the shore, and they sang a merry song as the party went across. "Don't dip your beard in the foam, father," they cried to Thorin, who was bent almost to his hands and knees. "It is long enough without watering it." "Mind Bilbo doesn't eat all the cakes," they called. "He is too fat to get through the keyholes yet." "Hush, hush, good people, and good night," said Gandalf, who came last. "Valleys have ears, and some elves have over-merry tongues. Good night." And so at last they all came to the last homely house, and found its doors flung wide. Now it is a strange thing, and things are good to have, and days that are good to spend are soon told about, and not much to listen to, while things that are uncomfortable, palpitating, and even gruesome may make a good tale, and take a deal of telling anyway. They stayed for long in that good house, 14 days at least, and they found it hard to leave. Bilbo would gladly have stopped there for ever and ever, even supposing a wish would have taken him right back to his hobbit hole without trouble. Yet there is little to tell about their stay. The master of the house was an elf friend, one of those people whose fathers came into the strange stories before the beginning of history, the wars of the evil goblins and the elves and the first men in the north. In those days of our tale, there were still some people who had both elves and heroes of the north for ancestors, and Elrond, the master of the house, was their chief. He was as noble and as fair in face as an elf lord, as strong as a warrior, as wise as a wizard, as venerable as a king of dwarves, and as kind as a summer. He comes into many tales, but his part in the story of Bilbo's great adventure is only a small one, though important, as you will see, if we ever get to the end of it. His house was perfect, whether you liked food, or sleep, or work, or storytelling, or singing, or just sitting and thinking best, or a pleasant mixture of them all. Evil things did not come into that valley. I wish I had time to tell you even a few of the tales or one or two of the songs that they had heard in that house. All of them, the ponies as well, grew refreshed and strong in a few days there. Their clothes were mended as well as their bruises, their tempers, and their hopes. Their bags were filled with food and provisions light to carry but strong to bring them over the mountain passes. Their plans were improved with the best advice. So the time came to Midsummer's Eve, and they were to go on again with the early sun on Midsummer morning. Elrond knew about runes of every kind. That day he looked at the swords they had brought from the troll's lair, and he said, "These are not troll make. They're old swords, very old swords of the high elves of the west, my kin. They were made in Gondolin for the goblin wars. They must have come from a dragon's hoard or goblin plunder, for dragons and goblins destroyed that city many ages ago. This, Thorin, the runes name Orcrist, the goblin cleaver in the ancient tongue of Gondolin. It was a famous blade. This, Gandalf, was Glamdring, foe hammer that the king of Gondolin once wore. Keep them well." "Whence did the trolls get them, I wonder?" said Thorin, looking at his sword with new interest. "I could not say," said Elrond, "but one may guess that your trolls had plundered other plunderers, or come on the remnants of old robberies in some holds in the mountains of the north. I've heard that there are still forgotten treasures of old to be found in the deserted caverns of the mines of Moria, since the dwarf and goblin war." Thorin pondered these words. "I will keep the sword in honor," he said. "May it soon cleave goblins once again." "A wish that is likely to be granted soon enough in the mountains," said Elrond. "But show me now your map." He took it and gazed long at it, and he shook his head. For if he did not together approve of dwarves and their love of gold, he hated dragons and their cruel wickedness, and he grieved to remember the ruin of the town of Dale, and its merry bells, and the burned bank of the bright river running. The moon was shining in a broad silver crescent. He held up the map, and the white light shone through it. "What's this?" he said. "There are moon letters here, beside the plain runes which say 5 feet high the door and 3 may walk across." "What are moon letters?" asked the hobbit, full of excitement. He loved maps, as I have told you before, and he also liked runes and letters and cunning handwriting, though when he wrote himself it was a bit thin and spidery. "Moon letters are rune letters, but you cannot see them," said Elrond. "Not when you look straight at them. They can only be seen when the moon shines behind them. And what is more, with the more cunning sort, it must be a moon of the same shape and season as the day when they were written. The dwarves invented them and wrote them with silver pens, as your friends could tell you. These must have been written on a midsummer's eve and a crescent moon a long while ago. What did they say? Asked Gandalf and Thorin together, a bit vexed perhaps that even Elrond should have found this out first, though really there had not been a chance before, and there would not have been another until goodness knows when. Stand by the grey stone when the thrush knocks, read Elrond, and the setting sun with last light of Durin's day will shine upon the keyhole. Durin, said Thorin. He was the father of the fathers of the eldest race of dwarves, the Longbeards, and my first ancestor. I am his heir. Then what is Durin's day? Asked Elrond. The first day of the dwarves' new year, said Thorin, is all should know the first day, the last moon of the autumn on the threshold of winter. We still call it Durin's day when the last moon of autumn and the sun are in the sky together. But this will not help us much, I fear, for it passes our skill in these days to guess when such a time will come again. That remains to be seen, said Gandalf. Is there any more writing? None to be seen by this moon, said Elrond, and he gave the map back to Thorin, and then they went down to the water to see the elves dance and sing upon the midsummer's eve. The next morning was a midsummer's morning, as fair and as fresh as could be dreamed. Blue sky and never a cloud, and the sun dancing on the water. Now they rode away amid songs of farewell and good speed, with their hearts ready for more adventure, and with a knowledge of the road they must follow over the misty mountains to the land beyond. That is the end of chapter 3 and the end of our stream for today. Let me know how you enjoyed it, how you are doing, what your weekend plans are. I'm going to take a quick drink break before I conclude today's festivities. And that is the last of the tea. Thank you very much for tuning in to this somewhat not traditional Janatee's Crafting Corner stream. I tried to make it a little bit, fit with the theme by making a little Gandalf buddy. A lot of loop stitches for the hair, and then I already had a pattern for the mage hat, which was worked pretty well. It was very fun to read back through a book I enjoyed so much in my childhood, and I appreciate you all tuning in. I will not do any of our typical announcements and things at the end, as I've already done them, but do check out the resources in the description. I hope all of your weekends are lovely, and I will see you all next week.